No, great to be with you guys today. No, it's virtual. We miss seeing you guys in person. I know I've been out to Kansas a couple times to your conference. It's always a great conference. Really do appreciate all the hospitality, but we are very happy to see you here today. I think we're going to start. Tess and I are going to have a little conversation back and forth, get to know us a little bit more, just as we're from the DC office, get some more information out to you. And then we do have some updates we want to give you as well. So Tess will give a congressional update, and I'll give a little bit of a HUD update just on a couple of things that have happened over the last few days, in a couple of weeks, just to make sure you have all the information you need coming out of this session. But with that, let me turn things over to Tess just to go ahead and introduce yourself, and then get things rolling.
Great, thanks, Georgie. I'm Tess Hembry. I'm NARAL's Director of Congressional Relations. We're based here in Washington, D.C. on a bit of a hazy day. I think we're getting some of that wildfire smoke. Sunny probably has a bit of that as well. So just a quick recap of what it is that I do at NARAL. I am responsible for everything Congress. So I deal with them on your behalf. I'm your eyes and the ears on Capitol Hill. I attend hearings, I talk to lawmakers, I deal with their staff, and I try to make sure that you guys, when you guys need something as a housing authority, you guys need funding for programs, you need HUD to change things like regulations, I am the one that communicates that to Congress. In addition to that, I also help direct NARA's grassroots operations. So all the work that you guys did for August recess, whenever we need one of you guys to contact your members of Congress, I help coordinate that and make sure that we've got a really strong ground game here in Washington, D.C. of NARA members, loud voice.
And then again, I'm Georgie Bannon. Let me do my little introduction here as well. Again, I'm the Director of Policy and Program Development. Tess and I work very closely together. She's on the congressional side. I'm really on the HUD side, the administration side of the programs. So, and that's kind of grown a little bit in the last couple of years. Not only is it HUD, the Housing Urban Development, but just in the couple of weeks, the Center for Disease Control with the eviction notice and order that came out. We've also even touched on Homeland Security with the public charge rule over the last couple of years. So that's the work that myself and my team work on, making sure your information, your stories, your situations, your programs, that information gets back to us, and we can share that with the HUD team, and the other way around. I can share information from the HUD team with you as well. So it's very much a back and forth situation. And because HUD, CDC, Homeland Security, that's really regulatory pieces, usually based on some kind of statute, some congressional work that's already been done. Tess and I work very closely together just to make sure that when there is a new statute or new component, a new law that comes into place, how is that going to be implemented? And I think that might be a great kind of place to start, Tess, and even on the small agency side of things, let's talk a little bit about that small agency provisions of a bill from a couple of years ago and how that came to be from the congressional side, and then I can talk a little bit on the regulatory side of it.
Sure, thanks. So I am the staff liaison for, I'm getting a little feedback there. I'm the staff liaison for the Small Agencies Task Force, and we've done a lot of work in the past few years on some pretty key legislation that we've seen signed into law, I think like 2 years ago at this point. When I first started at NARA like 7 years ago, we were pushing a bill called SHARP, the Small Housing Authority Regulatory Reform Proposal, something like that. So it's been a bill that we developed together with some of our partners here in DC, industry partners, really looking at ways to make small agencies' lives easier on the ground, streamline some of the reporting regulations and some of the things that you guys have to deal with, even though you've got a significantly smaller staff or housing authority than some of the bigger players like New York City, for example. So we're trying to just make lives easier for small agencies. So we're pushing through this legislation for a number of years. It was pretty technical legislation, so it was tough to get members of Congress who maybe don't have that kind of housing background to really champion the bill. But we did get really lucky in that Sunny Shaw, our president, who's with us, she developed a really great relationship with her Senator Crapo. And a couple of years ago, we were fortunate enough to have Crapo take over the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee in the Senate, which means that he was the senator that got to make decisions on what legislation related to housing was going to move forward in the Senate. So one of his top priorities was a bill that did a lot of work on Dodd-Frank reform. So remember years ago, there was a big banking bill basically that made changes to the banking industry after the housing market crash. And while he was working on putting together this bill, his staff realized that there was an opportunity for us to get some of those provisions for small agencies into this legislation. So with the help of Sunny, we worked with his committee staff and we got a handful of provisions that we've been working on with the SHARP legislation into this bill. It passed the Senate. It was a little touch and go, like we weren't sure that it was going to make it through, but in 2017, I think it was like March of 2017, the bill passed the Senate. And then we were lucky enough to have it pass the House as well later that summer. So since then, we were working with HUD, and Georgie can talk a little bit about the HUD side, but there are a few definitions in the small agencies bill that were difficult for HUD to implement, and so we've been working through that with them. But this is really one of the major milestones at NARO that we've achieved legislatively in the past probably 5 years, and it was very much focused on providing that regulatory relief for the small agencies.
Yeah, absolutely. And so as you can see that those definition pieces, I think, were key. This bill actually created a small agency section to the Housing Act of 1937. And all our public housing, voucher programs are all in this act. There was never a small agency section in it, so it created that. And then, so now we have a part of the statute of the Housing Act specific to small agencies, but how do we get that on the ground and actually working? And again, what is a small agency? Really became the big question. There was some guidance in the statute, really looking at size. So 550 units of combined public housing and vouchers. Less than that is a small agency. But they had a curveball on rural agencies. It had to be a rural agency as well, and that definition needed to be fleshed out. It was suggested how to do it, but even when Congress says, look at this and here's the guidance we want you to use in creating the regulation or the guidance to implement, HUD still has to do that. And so as that bill got passed, we went through and then looked at those definitions and gave suggestions to HUD. HUD came out with suggestions as well, and there's a back and forth that happens. So we take the information, go to our small agency advisory committee, share that information with them, take it to our housing committee as well, and also hear from other small agencies as when I come out to the Kansas conference or go out to other states conferences or regional conferences, and we get that feedback on what we're looking for and how to make this as flexible and as good for our agencies, our member agencies, as possible. So again, in the last probably year, in the last year, HUD did come out with that definition finally and listed all the agencies. So now we know who those small rural agencies are, those qualified small PHAs, where the statute applies to and where the flexibilities can be had. So again, it's a process. It takes quite a bit of time, quite a bit of teamwork. I know Tess and I were on phone calls. I think Tess was in an IKEA once on a phone call, and I was out at a soccer game or something, and we're talking to congressional staff, trying, can we change this word, change that word? And then, because the statute's the statute, we gotta follow the statute, and then we can play with it. We have a little more flexibility on the regulation side to what do the words mean. And so that's really the work that we do, not only for small agencies, but for all agencies across the country as well. And one other piece that we've been working on quite recently, and not in the authorizing side where this kind of came from, but on the appropriation side. Tess, I know when I can come back and we can both talk about it, but the ACC, the annual contributions contract that we were able to work with Congress through the appropriation side to make sure agencies had those contractual relationship kept together between HUD and the housing authorities.
Yeah, thanks, Georgie. So it's kind of a complex issue, but a couple of years ago, I think, was it 2 years ago? It must have been at this point. We noticed that HUD put out a notice that there would be some changes to the ACC, but the way they phrased it in they're reporting it was going to be nothing substantive, so we didn't need to worry about it. So we see these changes come out. You guys start to notice that, oh, wow, these contracts are a lot different than they were the previous year. And some of the language in there was really, really frustrating for us because they did things like change the contract to a grant agreement without any input from housing authorities, since you guys are a part of that contract or former contract. So they made these changes without really announcing it. The process wasn't right, and it was really frustrating for us because you guys needed to be able to draw down your capital funds, but without signing that contract, you couldn't do that. So we worked with members of Congress and their staff, particularly on the Appropriations Committee, because this happened right around the time that appropriations bills were being worked on in earnest. And so the appropriations staff recognized, thankfully, that we had some legitimate concerns with the process that HUD was using. And so they put some language in their appropriations bill for fiscal year 19 or 20, that put a stop to that and pulled the ACC contract back to an earlier point of time while the housing industry groups could talk to HUD and figure out some of these things on our own. So luckily, that means that you guys have been signing an older contract versus the new contract that they tried to put forward. And we were very fortunate to get the appropriators on board with that because there was a lot of back and forth between us and them and HUD. And there was a lot of skepticism at first about what it is that we were trying to tell them that you guys needed a place at that table. Georgie, do you want to talk a little bit about the HUD side as well?
Yeah, and we had meetings with HUD on this as well, and that was one of the important parts of the wording in the appropriations bill. It still allows us to have those conversations with HUD. Again, HUD are our partners in this. As housing authorities, they give us the funding to run our public housing, to run our voucher programs, to run other programs as well. We need to be able to work with HUD. So having Congress step in and say, HUD do this, agencies do that, that happens. But this is something that between the housing authorities and HUD that we should be able to work out. And as your industry group, we are working and working on that. So the language does allow that to happen. We've had meetings with HUD before the language, after the language. And right now we're in a stage because of COVID-19 and everything else, we're in a pretty natural, just let's get through certain things before we come back to the ACC discussion. But it is, very important to HUD to have this discussion and very important to housing authorities because there is an argument to be made that it's time to update the ACCs. That I don't think anyone really does dispute that. 1995 was the last update. And so there's programs that are in HUD programs now that weren't even thought of back in 1995. Moving to work, RAD, all those discussions, none of it was there. And so those do need to be taken into account, but it needs to be done on equal footing. So both sides, housing authorities and HUD are at the table. So we're starting to do that process. You can see how sometimes things come from Congress through the small agency side of things, but this was an issue that bubbled up to Congress instead of coming down from Congress. So we do have those flexibilities, and sharing that information between HUD and Congress is really what Tess and I do on that day-to-day basis for you as our members. Let's step back for a second, Tess, away from the business side of things. How did you get into the housing world? Is this something you wanted to do since the time you were 3 years old?
I wish I could say yes, but like a lot of you guys, I kind of stumbled my way into the housing world. My story is, by the way, politics, which has been a little bit less fun in the last 8 years or so, but that's okay. So I have a political science degree, and I moved out to Washington, D.C. about 12 years ago. And I had a family friend who owned a small consulting firm, and they needed somebody to work on policy issues for them. So they brought me on to work with them and their client, the American Planning Association. And what they needed was somebody to do housing policy. So I was like, great, housing sounds great. I don't really know that much about it, but I can learn. So about 12 years later, here I am, still doing housing policy, and I lucked into it, an issue area that I feel very passionate about, very deeply about. So it was fortuitous. Georgie, what about you?
a little bit of, strangely the same way I kind of fell into it. I'm a lawyer by training. During law school, we had a rental housing clinic. So student rental housing at Michigan State, at the Michigan State Law School, really dealt with undergrads and graduate students. And that was my first taste of really the real estate and landlord-tenant side of the law. I went to law school looking to be a tax attorney. I didn't want to talk to people. I didn't want to, I deal with numbers. I was going to deal with the numbers and go forward from there. But I got into court a few times in law school with this rental clinic and with the students, representing the students. And it really got a kind of a bug to be in the courtroom. And so graduated law school, put up my own shingle, did some real estate work, but also some criminal work. Always bad guys out there that pay the bills. So kept on going with that. And then an opportunity came to go do disaster work for Katrina and Rita during just after the storm. And really that got me to see, the importance of housing and how fragile housing can be in certain situations. During that time, I was a commissioner for a very small housing authority in Michigan, 100 public housing units, actually 97 public housing units, 100 vouchers. I was one of their vice chair of their commission. And so that's where I started seeing the HUD world of housing. So after all that, ended up in DC, working for a consulting firm, and started with the voucher program in the homeownership world, the homeownership vouchers. And that brought me over eventually to train as a trainer for NARO. Been training for almost 10 years with NARO now. And for the last less than 5 years, I've been their director of policy and really working on those nuts and bolts and the details of the programs. So yeah, really kind of stumbled into it. Didn't think affordable housing, particularly real estate I liked. Affordable housing really wasn't on my radar until I really got involved with the housing authority as a commissioner. So it's real fun. And now I can't imagine doing anything else. It's exciting work, and especially at the national level, seeing how every agency is a little bit different, and that's by design, and that's the ingenuity of the program, that each of your agencies is a standalone entity, and how you do things differently, and how we can take some of those best practices and move those over to other agencies, give other agencies ideas on how to do something a little bit different, and maybe help them in their streamlining the process or being a little more efficient in doing something. That's the kind of the role I see what I'm doing now, is really being that conduit sometimes between agencies and getting those, once there's some multiple agencies doing the same thing, maybe it makes sense to share it with everyone, and that could be through the HUD side of things. So it's it's a lot of fun in that side of things. I think time-wise, why don't we want to jump into some of our updates and see where we are? Do you want to give us a little congressional update? Yeah. Switching from the fun side to the congressional side, not always so fun, but the floor is yours, Tess.
Thanks. And sorry, I always have to give this disclaimer before I talk about Congress. It's always kind of a bummer because I rarely have positive news to share. Unfortunately, today is not one of those days that I do. So launching right into it. So we just, members of Congress came back, as much as anybody's going anywhere these days, from an August recess that was a bit abbreviated for some. It was like 5 weeks for the House and 4 weeks for the Senate, something like that. So now everybody is back in Washington, and they've got just I guess it's like 2 or 3 weeks before they adjourn again for October recess in advance of the election in November. So we're working with a really tight timeline, and we've got two pretty major things that Congress in theory needs to accomplish, but in reality we'll see. The one major one, I'm sure you guys are all aware, is the ongoing disagreement over what kind of additional resources need to be made available to the country to deal with COVID-19 and the economic fallout. So if you guys remember back to March, if anybody can remember that far back anymore, we saw a succession of several bills pass pretty quickly to deal with COVID-19. One was early on when the pandemic was just starting to show up in like Washington State and California. It was a small bill aimed at like CDC money, HHS. The next bill was a couple of weeks later after the world had kind of blown up in our faces, and we saw things like testing resources, nutrition assistance, and some things with unemployment in a smaller scale bill. And then a couple of weeks later was the CARES Act. So that one was the much bigger bill that did things like the unemployment bonuses, the direct payments to Americans, and the HUD funding. We got about $12 billion in additional resources for programs that you guys administer, as well as a lot of flexibilities on the HUD regulatory side so that you guys can do your jobs in this new environment. So that passed back at the end of March, and since then, Congress really has not done a lot to advance any additional legislation. And I say that Congress as a whole because the Senate and the House have taken individual steps. But since then, the conversation in March that was very much a bipartisan negotiation with the House, Senate, and the White House has fractured into political corners. So in May, we saw the passage of the HEROES Act. That is a $3.4 trillion package that was put together by House Democrats led by Speaker Nancy Pelosi. This was a fairly political document. This is the Democrats' priorities for COVID-19 assistance. We're very fortunate that it did include, I think it was like $6 or $7 billion in additional resources for HUD programs that you guys administer. There was $100 billion in there for rental assistance for Americans who are struggling to pay rent that do not currently receive any assistance. There was an extension of the unemployment bonus, a whole lot of money for state and local governments, and a lot of other things in there. So that was approved by the House back in May. And pretty much immediately once the bill was passed in the House, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell in the Senate said that that was not something that they were going to consider over there. It was a Democratic priority, and the Senate is Republican-led, so that made sense. So since then, we are waiting for the Senate Republicans to put forward their ideas or some sort of counter to the HEROES Act. Finally, after the 4th of July recess, we saw one of their plans come forward, the HEALS Act. So HEROES, all of these H words, HEROES was $3.4 trillion. HEALS in the Senate is $1 trillion, so much scaled down from what the House put out there. We were very fortunate. I was growing concerned the longer we got past like the Memorial Day recess that we weren't seeing any plans. The Senate was pushing back on a big package, but we were very fortunate that HUD funding did make it in there. That is a testament to the work of you guys, especially communicating to your senators that you needed additional resources. So it was a smaller scale than HEROES. It was just under $3 billion for HUD programs. And it included liability waivers for corporations and governments as they either continue to stay open during the pandemic or look at reopening. And they specifically listed housing authorities as getting those liability waivers as well. So we were pleased to see all of those things in the HEALS Act. But unfortunately, the HEALS Act never got a vote in the Senate. In the Senate, you need 60 votes to pass anything, and Senate Republicans don't have a 60-vote majority. So we knew right away when this bill came out that it didn't have a lot of hope for passing the Senate. And then in addition to that, there were a number of Senate Republicans that had concerns about the amount of money that was spent in March, and they didn't want to see another big-scale bill passed. So that $1 trillion price tag was just a bridge too far for them. So during the August recess, a few things happened. One, negotiations between the White House, the House, and the Senate completely broke down. To the point where they're basically not talking anymore, which is not a completely ideal situation to be in an ongoing pandemic. But and then once that happened, the administration put forward a series of executive orders to try to provide some relief in the way that they legally could with executive orders. And I think Georgia will probably talk about that in a second. But we saw things like the order to tell the CDC to deal with evictions and foreclosures, which they did later. You saw things like the expansion of unemployment benefits that states could apply for. Those things were done through executive order. And then in the meantime, during the August recess, the Senate put forward what they were referring to as a skinny HEALS Act. So HEALS was $1 trillion. Skinny HEALS was about $500 billion, and unfortunately stripped out all of the HUD funding, but the liability waiver is still there. Once the Senate came back into session last week, that was just last week, it was still clear that that was too big of a bill for those Senate Republicans that were very concerned about our massive at this point federal deficit. And so they scaled down the bill a little bit even farther from the skinny heels. I've been calling it skinnier heels, but I don't know if anybody has an official nickname for it. But it was about $300 billion and really did pare down the bill to a lot smaller than heroes, certainly, and even heels. So that bill was on the floor in the Senate last week, and it did fail because they don't have the 60 vote threshold. So that was expected. So that's a very long way of saying we are exactly where we were in March, right after the CARES Act passed. There's still no agreement on what needs to happen. But I will say that I'm starting to hear this week a lot more rumblings from rank and file members of Congress. So a lot of these discussions have been happening strictly at the leadership level. So Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell and the White House. A lot of the times your run-of-the-mill member of Congress isn't necessarily involved in those conversations. And I think they're starting to get frustrated with the inability of leadership to push something forward. And they're hearing from their constituents that there is a significant amount of need still on the ground. So there's I can't remember exactly, the Problem Solvers Caucus, something like that. I can't quite remember what they're calling themselves. It's a group of like 15 members of Congress that put together what they see as a negotiated deal between the HEROES and the HEALS Act. It unfortunately doesn't appear to include any housing. I don't know that this is necessarily going to go anywhere because I don't think Senate leadership in particular really wants to take direction from junior members of the House. But it just shows you that there's a lot of unhappiness with the way leadership has addressed this situation. So the common sentiment here in DC seems to be that we will not be seeing any additional COVID relief until after the election at the earliest. I'm starting to see that crack a little bit. Members are pretty upset and don't want to go home to their states and districts in October and ask to be reelected when they couldn't get additional help for families that are really in need right now. So I don't necessarily know that that makes anything more likely to happen, but I could see a smaller scale bill being considered before the election just because people want that as something that they can tell their constituents when they go home. So we'll see what happens. We've got a couple of weeks until the October recess. So in DC, a week is a lifetime, so there's plenty of time to get something done. So I said there were two issues that they're working on. That was just the COVID-19 conversation. Now we are also having a conversation about the end of the fiscal year, which is in 14 days. So fiscal year 2021 begins on October 1st. At this point, appropriations is not finished. So we're talking about a continuing resolution, which is a short-term spending bill that continues previous year funding forward into the next year for a specific point in time. So the House did manage to pass, I think, 10 of their 12 appropriations bills, including a transportation HUD bill that provided a pretty robust funding level for HUD programs. And then on top of that, an additional $49 billion in infrastructure investments to stimulate the economy. So we're really pleased with that bill. But that's not something that the Senate's going to consider, and the Senate hasn't begun their appropriations process yet. So there's a whole fight to be had on appropriations later on down the line. So the question right now is, what's in a CR? Is it just a straight extension of that date? Or are they going to include other things, especially since some programs have had increased costs of just running day-to-day operations since COVID-19? There's pretty much no agreement in Washington right now on anything, and unfortunately the CR is now at a point of increasing heated contention. So the House Democrats are optimistic about their chances of taking back the White House in November, and so they would like to see a short-term spending bill pushed into the new year. So they're looking at a February date so that they think that they'll be dealing with a Democrat in the White House, and so they'll want to negotiate with that administration to finalize spending for fiscal year 21. Whereas Senate Republicans, of course, are very optimistic about their chances of retaining the White House, and so they would prefer to see spending issues dealt with before the end of the calendar year so that they don't have to deal with that when a new Congress is forming, when the president is looking at his second term priorities. That's out of the way. So there's disagreement there just on the dates. There's a disagreement on what's included. Most leadership seems to be okay with what's referred to as a clean CR, which means just a straight extension of the date. But I think just given the situation we're in, there's a few things that has to be changed in a bill like that. And so there's disagreements on where that line is and what's going to be changed. And then on top of that, I find out that there's a growing disagreement over the census deadline, which is a really politically charged issue at this point. So I've been saying that a shutdown is very, very unlikely during an election year. It's never happened before. And I certainly don't think it's likely at this point, but it is 2020, so who knows? Anything's possible, it turns out. So there is a possibility that there's a government shutdown on October 1st when funding runs out, but I really, really, really don't think that anybody wants to get into October with a shutdown government and then go run for office. So I don't think it's likely. But anytime you have a bill that's running out, it's entirely possible. So my understanding of the timeline is that the House wants to get something passed this week. Since this conversation is a new one as of last night, apparently that might derail that timeline a little bit. But there will be something introduced in the House, whether it's that December 18th date that the Senate wants or sometime in February, that remains to be seen. But this week there should be some movement, at least on a continuing resolution or an understanding of where those fault lines lay, hopefully. So that's pretty much where we are in DC on Capitol Hill. You want to head a little bit down Independent or Constitution and talk a little bit about the HUD perspective, Georgie?
Sure. No, thank you, Tess. Great information.
Thanks.
Do want to remind everyone, go to the chat box if you have any questions for Tess or I. We'll touch those on those when we wrap up here. But yeah, we will take questions. Feel free to type those in if you have any. But yeah, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about HUD, a little bit about the CDC. So again, we'll talk HUD, CDC pieces. Right now, I have three things I really do want to touch on to make sure I get that out to you. First up, anyone here in Elk County, Kansas? Any Elk County Kansans on the call? If you are, in the reactions, you can give me a thumbs up or anything. No one? All right. This brings me to the inspections discussion. If you are in, or you have any friends in housing authorities in Elk County, Kansas, you are the one county in Kansas that potentially could get inspections starting in October right now. HUD has started a process, the REACT, the Real Estate Assessment Center, to reopen the REACT inspections, the HUD inspections. Back in August 7th, actually, HUD put out the notice and put out the information to housing directors that we're going to start the process up and how we're going to do that process. Part of that process is making sure the county, based on the counties across the country, there's 3,224 counties across the United States, that of those counties, HUD is going to look at and use Johns Hopkins data and Harvard data and the Harvard process to determine the risk levels of those counties. And any county that's in a low risk, which means less than one new COVID case per 100,000 people over the last week, so a very low number, less than one new case over the last week per 100,000 people. If those would be considered green or low risk counties. Elk County, Kansas is one of those counties that has been green for, I believe, about 6 or 7 weeks. That means that you're in this 45-day window that HUD has started looking at these the county level data. That gets us to September 21st, actually next week. If, again, agencies in Elk County stay green through next week, there's a potential they could get a 14-day notice. The normal REACT inspection 14-day notice that HUD's been using since last year. And then that will still need to be green for those 14 days. And then that will get us to October 5th. October 5th will be the first potential day for an inspection. Now, that being said, even if you're in a green county, in Elk County, Kansas, or the 57 other counties across the United States that are green for 7 weeks. Yes, that's true. Only 57 out of the 3,224 are green for the last 7 weeks right now. Then you still may not be inspected. You need to be a high priority inspection as well, which means generally that you're troubled based on your inspection reports. You get a score less than 60, or you haven't had a previous score in the last 3 years, or you had an inspector that was disbarred by HUD, that was taken off as an inspector. So again, there's not many of those. HUD will probably be looking at more multifamily properties rather than public housing properties. But again, out of that list of 57 counties in the United States, Kansas only has one, it's Elk County. So if you know anyone there, let them know, have them feel free to reach out to us and we can walk them through the process and the information if they need anything there. So that's inspections. Again, that process will keep ramping up through the end of this year and into next year as well. The CDC order. CDC order is a halt to evictions. Where did it come from? It came out of one of those executive orders that the president signed and gave instructions to various administration officials. One of those was the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and where CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, are under the HHS, to look at, from a public health perspective, would evictions help stop the spread or limit the spread of COVID-19, particularly across state lines, because it's the federal jurisdiction there. The CDC director then did give an order September 1st saying, yes, evictions can lead to increased exposure to COVID-19, particularly if that individual has a possibility of becoming homeless because of that eviction. So that order then triggered declaration from the CDC director triggered the order that became effective September 4th. That order stops evictions across the country for covered individuals if those individuals provide their landlord a declaration that they qualify for the CDC order. Again, that to be qualified to be a covered person under the order, the person has to have given their best efforts to obtain government assistance for housing. Most of our families have, particularly if they've gone through recertifications because of lost income or lost jobs. There's an income limit. The person does not expect to make more than $99,000 as an individual or $198,000 as a joint filer in 2020, calendar year 2020. If the person did not file a tax return in 2019, they're eligible. And if they received a stimulus check from the CARES Act, they would also be eligible there. The person is unable to pay the full rent because of loss of income due to loss of hours, a layoff, or extraordinary medical expenses, out-of-pocket medical expenses. That's a little bit of an added piece to this. The person, though, does need to make their best efforts to make timely payments. So even partial payments here. It does talk about partial payments and being able to accept partial payments here and make those best efforts. So I know that's something that doesn't always happen in the rental world, that once, especially if you start an eviction process, you very rarely take partial payments because in the legal system that could stop the process. But here, the person has to make their best effort to make a partial payment if they can't make the full payment. And then the homelessness side of it. That eviction would render that person homeless or force that person into to live in close quarters. So whether that's sharing housing with somebody else or shared even shelter components as well. So those components are in a declaration. That declaration needs to be signed by all adults in the property and on the lease and given to the landlord. Once that declaration is given to the landlord, it stops the eviction. The eviction stops and again, as long as the declaration was given between September 9th and December 31st of this year, so all the way until December 31st, that eviction is stopped. Courts may or may not dismiss the case, may suspend the case. All that's kind of still up in the air. There's no details on if there's a current eviction process going on, but the eviction does stop. It is important that declaration, again, is the responsibility of the tenant to sign and provide to the landlord. HUD on a call yesterday asked housing authorities to share the declaration with their tenants. There is no requirement to do that. The CDC order does not require you as a housing authority to provide the declaration to your tenant or to your voucher families. However, based on your, as an executive director or as an agency, you decide to provide the information, it's up to you how you want to handle the situation. Provide the information, don't provide the information, whatever your agency feels is best for your community and how you're providing that declaration. Just know if a public housing resident brings you a declaration signed because they're not paying the rent and they're not paying the rent, that would stop any eviction. Also, this is only for non-payment of rent, criminal activity, other violations of the lease, all still are evictable. Health and safety violations, all those things are still evictable offenses. Late fees, penalties can still accrue. That's different than the CARES Act moratorium that expired back in July. So if there are late fees in your lease, they can still be take effect. So the lease is what's guiding there. If you don't have late fees in your lease, you can't put in late fees on that lease. So important pieces also, there are some penalties for an agency for not following the order. There are also penalties for tenants as well for a false or a fraudulent declaration. Tenants who provide a false or fraudulent declaration have the penalties of perjury, which is up to about 5 years in jail potentially and a fine. Agencies that improperly evict someone under this order could see a penalty of $200,000, or if that person passes, leads the death, the eviction leads to the death of the person, it could be $500,000 in penalty to the agency. Both are criminal offenses, both for the tenant and the housing authority. So important to make sure that if you're receiving those declarations, it is not your job to determine if the declaration is true or false. If you have any concerns about that, it is the U.S. Justice Department. They'll be the ones that will follow up and do any investigation that is needed on the declarations. The U.S. Justice Department will follow up on all of that. And if they think an agency or landlord is improperly evicting, Justice Department will also investigate that. So again, that is in effect. We do plan in the next couple of weeks having another webinar. We had one last week. We'll have one probably next couple of weeks to follow up on questions that were asked during that session. We had over 200 questions on that session, and we're going through those questions, and we'll bring those back into a webinar and address those questions and new ones. So keep an eye on your email to see that coming. One last piece I wanted to come to as new guidance that just came out in the last couple of days from HUD, and it is on reporting of the CARES Act funds. And Tess talked about the CARES Act that passed back in March of this year, provided funding for public housing, also for the voucher programs, both admin fee and HAP, Housing Assistance Payment Funds. The reporting of those funds through your accounts guidance was provided. In addition to that, there's actually 3 parts to the notice that came out, PIH Notice 2020-24. Is the first part actually extends the availability of those funds. Right now, the public housing funds originally were only allowed to be used till the end of this year, end of 2020. That has been extended now to the end of 2021. So any CARES Act public housing dollars you received can be now used through the end of 2021. On the voucher side, any admin fees you received for your voucher program through the CARES Act in the two lump sums that you received over the last few months, those now also can be used not by the end of the year, but by the end of 2021. So you have an extension of additional year to use those funds. HAP money. If you're an agency who is applying for HAP funds because you are in shortfall or have an increased per unit cost in your voucher program, there's the 2 categories you can apply for. They actually have different deadlines. Shortfall funding. If you are receiving shortfall funding and you're in the shortfall pot of money, that needs to be used by the end of this year still, 2020. You will know that from your HUD folks, and you will definitely know if you're getting shortfall funds. If you're receiving extraordinary circumstances for increased per unit cost funds, and we do suggest if your per unit cost has increased by more than 2%, so if you from over the year, so if the number HUD used is 100%, HUD considers that. If you're at 102% right now, you can apply for these extraordinary expense costs, per unit costs, to get additional funding for your HAP program. Those funds, when you receive them, will be available through the end of 2021 as well. All the money is available 2021 except shortfall funding for HAP. Shortfall funding is 2020 still. Two reporting pieces I want to touch on before we turn to questions. There's annual reporting for, like you normally do through your unaudited financials and audited financials as a housing authority. HUD has added new columns to the FDS, the financial data schedule, for CARES Act funding. So you'll need to go in, add those columns to your FDS, and then you can keep track of the funding on an annual basis through the FDS system, financial data schedule. That will be for all agencies must do that who've received CARES Act funds. If you are, this took effect on 6/30/2020, so fiscal years that ended on 6/30. If you are an agency who had a fiscal year end of 6/30 and already submitted your unaudited financials, you will need to update those, and HUD will be reaching out, and HUD will be reaching out to update those to add the CARES Act columns before they can be accepted. So they will need to be updated and redone before HUD will accept them. The final piece is quarterly reporting. This is part of the statute, part of CARES Act. It required any agency that received $150,000 or more from the CARES Act from any program in the CARES Act to report on a quarterly basis. This quarterly accounting and quarterly reporting will be done by a HUD portal. The portal is not available yet. The HUD CFO, Chief Financial Officer, is still working on adopting and opening the portal. HUD will provide more information when it is open. But the first due date is actually, the second due date is October 10th. The first due date was actually July 10th. There will be retroactive reporting all the way back to March 27th based on the CARES Act passage. But keep an eye out for the HUD notice. It may be extended past October 10th if the portal is not open. But again, only for agencies that receive more than $150,000 will need to do quarterly reporting. So it may not a lot of agencies, but there are some out there. So that's really the three pieces I want to touch on. Again, we're available for questions if there's any questions out there. We do have a few minutes left here, and Tess and I will be more than happy to answer any questions. But once we leave, there's definitely more information on the NARO website, and we're available to be contacted as well. So go to the NARO website, naro.org. We have a coronavirus page, naro.org/coronavirus. Lots of great information there. You can follow up there, reach us there as well if questions do pop up.
And I just wanted to quickly thank you guys. We had a pretty crazy goal this August of sending 8,501 letters to members of Congress in the White House. I was a little nervous about that number of letters because it's pretty high. But we managed to send almost 13,000 letters this year. So that's pretty amazing. You guys definitely were heard loud and clear in DC. And I just want to give a shout out to Southwest, NARO, and Kansas in particular, because I know you guys did a lot of really good work this August. We had a regional competition. You guys came in fourth, which is pretty good out of 8 regions, and you sent almost 2,000 letters. So I just wanted to thank you guys for all the work that you did this summer. It makes a really big difference.